Pokémon is doomed. Welcome to the Popcog channel and the first episode of Doomsday, where we explore some of our favorite content that just might be heading towards the edge of a cliff. And today, we're going to be talking about Pokémon. What's Pokémon, I hear you asking? What, have you been living under a rock? Pokémon is one of the most popular game series ever created, with its own spin-off animes and more toys than you could shake a stick at. And its creator, Game Freak, was properly named because it turned a bunch of little kids into little game freaks. With the release of Pokémon ZA on the horizon, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet in the rear view, and the smash success of Palworld out of nowhere, I think I discovered something. And I think you might want to sit down for this, but Pokémon has a problem. Part 1. The Good Old Days. Back in my day, we didn't have any of these newfangled literal trash Pokémon. We just had your good old-fashioned electric rats and fire dogs, which we had fight for sport. But that's kind of the thing with Pokémon. For most players, nothing beats their first experience with the game. A fresh set of eyes upon a strange land where you set off into a magical land of creatures, discovering new and exciting species along the way. Each encounter a new chance to discover something new. But now, those good old days are gone, baby. While the original 151 may seem like a small number of Pokémon at this point, fewer and fewer get added every generation, and the average fan knows more and more of each Pokémon. That once magical land is now filled with familiar, horrifying faces. No longer are you surprised to see a useless fish transform into a mighty sea dragon, or a fish turn into an octopus, or all of the fish, really. All of the fish are the weird ones. And so, our clock ticks closer to midnight. Only so many new and interesting Pokémon can exist. And sure, while there is the occasional cool idea, many of the phenomenal designs that stick with us to this day still come from the original Pokémon. Worse still, we all have our favorites, and many players just want to use some of their favorite Pokémon in every game, making us even less interested in that keychain with a face. But, Papa Cog, you say? When Gold and Silver came out, everyone loved that game more than Red and Blue, and they added a lot of Pokémon. And to that I say, yes, and it only built upon what already existed in Red and Blue. From there, and as of Ruby and Sapphire onwards, Pokémon fell into a trap laid out by its own theme song. Part 2. I want to be the very best, but I gotta catch 'em all. In almost every Pokémon, from the second you turn on the game and you leave your mom's house never to return, two driving forces are presented to you as a player. 1. I want to collect as many of these horrifying little creatures as I can, and 2. I want the strongest one possible to shut up this kid that calls himself my rival. And, as of Ruby and Sapphire, these two elements start to grow apart. Having grown tired of the fairly straightforward combat of the first and second generation of games, of whichever Pokémon had the type advantage won, and with the introduction of held items in Gold and Silver being a relatively minor change, abilities were added to spice things up. And being the best just got harder. Interesting strategies and counters developed, and the game became not just for little babies. But now, Game Freak had a problem. There's now too many Pokémon with too many abilities, and even with this in mind, some Pokémon were just consistently stronger than others, and some types were all around more common or less common, resulting in unintentional imbalances. And with this, our clock actually ticks 2 notches closer. They had to get rid of some Pokémon. Getting them all no longer meant catching them all. It meant getting them all in the region in which you're located, which, that's not in the song. And while this addition of new moves may have made the combat more interesting, this was a temporary fix to a long-term problem. New metas were quickly formed, sending us back to square one. And this, by the way, is also true of the addition of the double battles in Ruby and Sapphire itself. It may have expanded the strategy to a separate, but ultimately similar combat style, just delaying this is another inevitability. And so, while all the fans who wanted to catch them all were upset, the rest of us could rest easy knowing that combat was relatively untouched. Part 3. Gimmicky nonsense. But of course, this didn't remain the case. From this point onwards, gimmicks in combat became the norm, with the occasional exception of games like Diamond and Pearl adding accessibility options via online play instead. And so, our Doomsday clock begins to tick faster. Was doubles not enough? Black and White added triples. Feeling nostalgic for your old favorites? Well, let's give them temporary evolutions in held items in X and Y. But look at how sick our Charizard looks now! Still feeling nostalgic for your old Pokemon? Well, let's add some regional variants, which change their types around, and also add a held item which gives some Pokemon some new moves. And that's still not doing it for you? Let's mix the mechanics of X and Y in Sun and Moon for Gigantamaxing and Dynamax moves for the Pokemon that do get bigger, but you do have to catch a specific Pokemon for this. And now we're all tired of this being a held item, but you still want to change the Pokemon's type, so Scarlet and Violet adds Terastallizing, which is undoubtedly the worst. And sure, all of these changes did change something, but each one was entirely unique to the game in which it was found. Now, not only can we not get every Pokemon we want in each game, we can't even fight the way we want in each game, and we're still, now collecting all of them includes all these additional variants with special typings, becoming even more difficult. And so here we stand, betrayed by our own favorite theme song. So as the Doomsday Clock ticks once more, let us reflect that recent games have also tried to resolve many of these gripes of including missed Pokemon through the use of paid DLC. Thanks, Nintendo. Another tick for you. But where do all these problems stem from, and why is the fanbase getting ever more discontent? This issue comes from our familiarity with whichever the first series we've played is. And I imagine in 5 years from now, whoever's first game was Scarlet and Violet will look back at it and think that it wasn't that bad, and it might be their favorite. They'd be wrong, but they'll probably think that. But these games don't just last for one generation, they stand a staggering amount, and so the amount of players who have played one or two before the new one is growing and growing. And the more you've played, the less happy you become. So why doesn't this impact other similar long-running games, like Final Fantasy? Because unlike Final Fantasy, Pokémon isn't about anything other than the Pokémon. There aren't really any character developments in the games. It's just you and your little monsters roaming free. And while later games in the series do try to add a story, ultimately it gets left by the wayside as we mash through every text option to get to our next Pokémon battles and to catch more little monsters. And so, with this absence of character development and story, we have nothing to focus on but the similarities to the previous games, and how different they are, and often for the worse as a unique feature. So, this is really bad, right? Pokémon is doomed. But those who are paying attention may have noticed that I skipped past Legends Arceus, the only quasi-mainline game in the series to date. Part 4. Just do something different. Users generally loved Arceus. The catching mechanic was different, it was quasi-open world, the combat was extremely varied from the original. It was familiar, yet different. So different, in fact, that people weren't able to so easily compare it to the ones before it. And behold, a positive user experience. It was by no means perfect, but it was refreshing. And sure, it wasn't Pokémon with guns like Palworld, but it was something new. If anything, while Palworld showed us that people have grown tired of the same Pokémon game coming out time and again, we also don't enjoy something that different. At least, not for too long. So, can Pokémon save itself? I think the answer is a resounding maybe. Assuming Pokémon Legends ZA will be similar in style to Arceus, I think we'll see another bump in user scores and people will generally enjoy it. But Pokémon can't be relaxed here. Just because it's new doesn't mean it won't grow stale, and the Legends series of games can fall into the exact same trap the main series did. If anything, Pokémon needs to loosen the reins a little. From the popularity of games like Pokémon Showdown, it's clear that people just want to play with all of their Pokémon and do whatever. To heck with balance. Do their own thing. And that's totally achievable. It kind of exists already in Pokémon Home, right? If Pokémon were to expand Home to be a full-fledged game of that nature, where players could gather, chat, compete, trade, and explore and catch as well, this would be a massive win, being updated as a main hub and even potentially a launching platform for both future and past games of the series. And so, here we sit, with Pokémon 1 second from midnight on our Doomsday Clock. Here's hoping that they can reverse course before it's too late. Hey everyone, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Please leave a comment to try to get a little discourse going, and otherwise, don't forget to let me know other video topics that you guys would like to see, and let's keep these videos going. Bye! I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was. Bang. Bow, 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 bow.